kicking us off this evening for our examination of 1967, British Disease, Productivity, and the Summer of Love. The Summer of Love was actually 1967, that Californian festival whose ripples stretched right across the world. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Erasmus Historical and Cultural Research Forum. This is one of three launch events at which we are launching three distinctive streams of research during the next 3 months. Rowan Williams, Master of Magdalen College, Cambridge, will be here on September the 21st to discuss and to launch Reformation Consequences, it being, of course, in the autumn 500th anniversary of Martin Luther's decision to put those 95 theses to the church door at Wittenberg. And David Abelafia, really rather soon, here with us this evening, one of the fellows of the Erasmus Forum, will be launching our discussion and stream of researches on the history of banking, and in David's case, it will be the history of banking and bankers in medieval Italy. And England and its cultures, by the way, part of the very valuable work that we've been doing with the Paris Federation of Academies in London, that is work that will be resumed before the end of the year. A very, very quick note on origins. Many of those here will know that this program, this independent organization, represents the continuation in many ways of the work done by the Cultural Prosperity Program at the Legatum Institute. And in the course of the summer and autumn of last year, it became evident to the director and others that the interests of that particular program would be advanced and preserved were we to become an independent organization, which we are now to very happy effect, and ably supported as part of our work here with Gaynor Howells and Georgina Brooke, who joined the forum just within the last month or so. There will be a quarterly bulletin published, the Erasmus Bulletin, which will incorporate the work and the insights of contemporary historical researchers with an ability to advance and deepen our understanding of certain contemporary problems. This is a research and publishing organization. It benefits and it breaks down some of the barriers, the artificial barriers that have arisen between the academy, the university, and the wider world. It is a venture in the field of public education. Its concentration is on historical research, which has an ability to widen and deepen our understanding of certain contemporary problems. Like the eponymous figure of Erasmus, who's seen there in the portrait medallion that he himself commissioned in 1519, it stands for a certain conception of the unity of knowledge, a belief that the connection between the world of the university or academic research and the wider world needs to be reasserted and re-understood. And it also believes in the objectivity of research. Universities are quite often not often the best place to appreciate and to understand and to further the consequences of their own researches. So here we stand now at the Erasmus Forum at the intersection of a narrower world and a wider world that needs to be better understood. So there's nothing more boring really than people talking about methodology and how to do things. This is true of actors or musicians, and it's certainly true of historians. We should get stuck into the business of understanding one of the topics in one of our research streams, states in turmoil, countries that have entered into patchy and difficult periods, turbulent seas, difficult circumstances. And when we look outside of the world today, I think we might all agree that things are not exactly going tickety-boo. So let's look at the 50s and the 60s. And first of all, we'll be going into the economics of productivity with one of the great friends of this organization and one of the fellows of the Erasmus Forum in the person of Nick Crafts. Nick is really one of the very greatest of all-time British economic historians, and in our own time, he stands really at the peak of Mount Olympus for the range and the ability he has to synthesize so many different statistical sources of information and make it comprehensible to a wider audience. His McArthur lectures delivered recently in Cambridge took the theme productivity It's a problem that was first discovered and thought about in the mid-60s and has come back to haunt us. But what we mean by productivity and what that British disease was all about is what we're going to be learning about, first of all, in the company of Nick Crafts. Nick, the floor is yours. And I'm going to start by asking a few questions. Productivity, Nick. What do we mean by that word? And what do economists mean by that word, particularly, and economic historians?
When we talk about productivity, we are interested in how much output can be produced from the use of an input. Most often we talk about labour productivity. How much output do we get from an hour's work or a person's employment or whatever? We could equally well talk about capital productivity, and sometimes that would be useful. And we even have the idea of total factor productivity when we try and look at all the inputs that are used. But basically it's output relative to input. How do we measure output? Well, we usually measure it by monetary value of output, although one could in some circumstances just measure physical output. But if we want to add up the output of the economy overall, we've probably got no alternative but to do it in monetary form. And that, I think, introduces the biggest difficulties in measuring productivity, or at least measuring it in a comparative way, because if we want to look at what's happened over time, or we want to look at one country compared with another, we need to find some kind of price index to iron out the effects of inflation in the case of one country, or to iron out differences perhaps in purchasing power parity. The exchange rate isn't always a good measure to use. So the real problems, I think, probably arise in how to construct good price indices.
We first become aware of this, well, some people have become aware of it as a problem for the British economy in the mid-60s, but had it been a problem for a long time before that?
I think you're right that vocabulary turned to the productivity problem. And we had things like productivity bargaining. The Forley plan was perhaps the most famous one of those. And we got to a phase where we started to realise that other countries were doing better than us, and that this wasn't simply a reconstruction after World War II. It was a more deep-seated, long-run kind of thing. I don't think the vocabulary had particularly been used before, but certainly in earlier generations there was a lot of angst about how well Britain was doing in economic terms, which could actually in later vocabulary be translated into a productivity problem. I think the point at which this really shows up is the beginning of the 20th century, and it's that feeling that we're falling behind the United States and now Germany. A famous book published in, I think, 1907 called Made in Germany made this sort of point. So I think from then on there was quite a definite undercurrent of, are we really economically capable? Are we as productive and competitive as we should be? And this crystallises, for example, towards the end of World War II, when the Board of Trade organises working parties to look at the state of British industry. And they concluded it wasn't a pretty sight.
So it's there as a problem, long time before even the Duke of Edinburgh starts talking about productivity in the mid-60s. And it's much more than, it's not just a question of work-shy layabouts having long tea breaks. There's a deep kind of structural problem.
Yes, I think it is worth starting with the work-shy, if you like. Well, not so much the work-shy. I think what we can think about is that firms and their workers, in effect, strike effort bargains. What kind of effort bargain you get depends obviously on bargaining power, and it also depends on how much loot there is to share out. how much supernormal profit which the workers can benefit from, possibly including benefiting by having more of them than are truly needed, and so on. The Coventry car plants that I grew up with in the 1970s were redolent of that. But beyond that, the interesting issues are about how much investment the economy has, so how much capital equipment, how up to date the capital equipment is with which workers operate. We might be interested in what could be called the human capital, rather fancy term, but we're thinking there of the education and skills of the labour force. That will affect their productivity. And of course, more generally than just the effort bargain, how well those inputs are organised. And the organisation, presumably, is a pretty important function of management.
Right, so with that dreaded word management, I can take myself out of the picture now, stop interjecting, and ask you to take it away. I know you've got lots of graphs and stats that you want to show us, and there's nobody's quite as good as Nick at introducing an element of drama into the presentation of the stats and pathology. So away you go.
Right, well, while you're heading to the back, or wherever you're going, let me just say that the Summer of Love may have rippled across the world, but it certainly didn't get to Mansfield in 1967. That's the year I did my A-levels. I was in a small state grammar school. It's a year I remember extremely fondly because it's the year that changed my life. If you passed A-levels well enough and were fortunate enough to get the right interview, you got into Cambridge. So I went from some of my contemporaries going down the pit in Mansfield to a different kind of world, for which I'm ever grateful. Okay, so it wasn't the summer of love, but it was the summer of A-level success. Okay, right. Post-war British productivity failure. I'll try and skip through these quite quickly because I want there to be a fair amount of time for questions at the end. And I'm not going to sort of make it, I hope, too technical or dwell on the numbers too much, but I can see one or two familiar faces and they will know that I have to have a numbers fix every now and then. Okay, so I think the theme that we're interested in here could be put in the vocabulary of relative economic decline. What that I think means is just what we were talking about a moment ago, that you do grow, your economy gets absolutely larger, but you grow less quickly than the countries with which you would want to compare yourself. And our natural peer group is probably large European economies, France, Germany, Italy, and so on. If you grow more slowly than other countries for long enough, even if you start first and have a big lead initially, you can end up being overtaken. And their productivity levels, their output per person levels go above you. And that's actually what did happen to the UK, as I'll show you in a moment. Some people have correctly, I think, pointed out this term that can be used quite politically. I'll note that and pass on because I do like numbers and I think the numbers are pretty clear that there is a problem to talk about. Okay, the other thing I want to do in this talk is to say I'm not sure you should approach this topic entirely as an economist, or at least not a very sort of mainstream modern model-driven economist, because I'm going to try and argue that history matters here. And putting it simply, I'm going to suggest that the growth performance that you have in a particular period is influenced a lot by what went before. My old classics teacher would have said, I hope I'm getting this right, Hal, you tell me if I'm not, you don't start with tabula rasa. Yeah, so that's quite important. I'm going to say what went wrong in this early post-war period I think had quite deep historical roots, and that's me as the economic historian coming out in a different way. The most acute phase of relative decline, I think, is the period that we're looking at. Okay, and there are some numbers which will help us just locate the problem. The way this chart works is whatever real GDP per person or per head was in the UK in a given year, I'll call that the baseline and call that 100, and then I'll compare the other economies with the UK as 100. Obviously the absolute numbers going up. So of those highlighted years, in 1950, the way to read the chart is that real GDP per person in the economy in the United States was 37.8% higher than in the UK. In Germany, which was of course hugely affected by the aftermath of the war, in that year real GDP per person was 61% of the UK level. And the rest of the chart works in the same way. I guess that's fairly straightforward. I hope it is. All right, I've highlighted, I tend to do this, the obvious bit that I'd like you to focus on for now. Let's take 1950 as the start of the period we're looking at, and I'll controversially take 1979 as the end. I can't quite remember what happened in 1979, but something or other did. But this covers the 1950s, 60s and 70s. Okay, and I think the relativities that we want to consider are the UK compared with Germany and France. Germany, this is of course West Germany in 1979 that we're talking about. By 1979, its real GDP per person was almost 16% higher than Britain's, having been 40% or so below in 1950. That seems to me catching up and being overtaken. Yeah. And France is a similar sort of story. By 1979, they're a bit ahead of Britain, about 11% on this standard method of measurement. The doyen of these kinds of numbers is Angus Maddison, who died a few years ago, but I think we're all in his debt for creation of the data. We could talk about the accuracy later. Let me just take it as given for the moment. Okay, now let's just touch on my history matters proposition. I'm going to do it in various ways, but here's my first way. I'm going to suggest that in 1950 a quite important thing that had happened was the interwar period. The interwar period for Britain was not a period of massive depression as in the United States, but it was a lengthy period of persistent unemployment. And I think the message that comes out of the 30s is we have had a massive unemployment problem. We must do something about it. Something must be done, I think someone or other said. And there seemed to be things that you could do in this sort of bold new Keynesian dawn, if you wish. And you might attach a very high priority to achieving full employment. I think that is the hallmark of the 1950s, to be understood in the context of what they'd been through. So broadly speaking, I think we saw quite a lot of loss of faith in the market economy to deliver full employment. But full employment was something the voters would want, and if you could persuade them that you were better at delivering it than the opposition, that was good for election purposes. The legacy that also goes with the interwar period is that in the travails of the 1930s, Britain had become protectionist. It had not only become protectionist, it had become a very cartelised economy. This was a deliberate policy in the 1930s to try to stop prices falling and get them to increase. And there were good short-run management issues in the economy that said maybe there was something to that strategy. You'll see modern economists say in a depressed economy, in the liquidity trap, you should do everything you can to raise prices. That includes giving firms market power in the short term. And then the economics textbook tends to say, when the emergency is over, you go back to the status quo ante. You take their market power away. If only it was as easy as that. In Britain, it took about 40 years to reverse what had happened in that period. The interwar period was unfortunate for the UK because the interpretation of it that politics took meant that future policy was constrained, and I'll try and explain that in a bit more in a moment. And then I'm going to argue that the new policy framework that came out of the interwar period interacted quite badly with British institutions. Which institutions? The way that Britain ran its firms, so the nature of corporate governance in the UK, and the way that Britain ran its industrial relations, the nature of industrial relations system in the UK. Now, we probably don't really need this because we've had the introduction from Hal, but I did put in a slide saying how might we measure labour productivity, which is probably the most commonly talked about model. Output per unit of labour input, we've discussed that. Real GDP per person in the economy is not really a measure of labour productivity. It's a measure of output relative to the total number of people. Not all those people are in the labour force. We could measure real GDP per person employed, and that's often done, and maybe the data points us to doing that, but we'd probably prefer to measure real GDP per hour worked. We know that over time, hours worked have fallen a lot in the UK economy. They've about halved since mid-Victorian times. We know that at various times, different countries have different amounts of hours worked. And so, generally speaking, it's a good idea, if you can, to go to the hour work measure. This is another of those charts which deals with things on the basis of taking the UK as the base point, taking it as 100 in each year, and comparing the other economies. This is not GDP per head. Y upon HW? This is output per hour worked. It's that measure of labour productivity. In the market sector, you've basically taken out completely non-marketed output, what the government produces and so on. Let me say, I think it's pretty hard to measure productivity in the government sector. And there might be a variety of reasons for that, but I think we might in a way get a cleaner view if we look at the market sector. So that's what we've done here. There we see that the US was well ahead of Britain by the early 1950s, and that was much remarked on at the time. I'd forgotten actually my answer to you earlier, Hal. We actually had something called the Anglo-American Productivity Council in the early 1950s, which sent teams of British industrialists, trade unionists, sundry academics, whatever, to look at what the Americans were doing and how they were doing it so much better. So it was sort of understood to some extent. Again, with West Germany and France, you get this picture. It's a bit more stark here if we actually measure it as labour productivity in the market sector. They start well behind. West Germany has caught up by 1960. They're both well ahead by the end of the 1970s. So this suggests the problem's a bit bigger than if you just look at GDP per person. After 1979, then you'll notice that these numbers stop getting worse, if you like, and they get marginally better in the next 20 years or so. Going back to an earlier question of yours, Hal, sometimes we talk, when we do a quick run through for students, we sometimes sort of say, what are the key things that affect productivity most? And I used to, and I still do quite often, borrow the checklist that the New Labour government of nearly 20 years ago, or about 20 years ago, developed. This goes through pretty much the sort of things I was talking to you about. Investment skills and innovation matter, and then the background factors are enterprise, I'd call that the economic environment, the sort of things which inform how much investment you'll do, the incentives that you face and so on. And I do think, as I'll say in a minute, competition probably matters quite a lot. Quite important, I think, to remember that where policy is concerned, politicians are not unambiguously interested in productivity. They're interested, I think, in votes. Let's suppose they're interested in votes, though I must admit in the last few months I've started to doubt that. I've always told students that politicians are interested in votes. Let me retain my simple view of the world, if I may. Votes and productivity improvement they're not necessarily easy bedfellows, if you like. Productivity improvement typically causes there to be losers as well as winners. The losers don't like it. They become left behind voters, or whatever it might be. If, for example, the policy that you choose is some kind of trade liberalisation, globalisation, some people in that will be hurt by imports. Other people will gain from being in the exporting sectors and so on. If you think of things which obviously hold productivity back hugely in the British economy today, the one I as an economist would pick on, which I don't think the general public would ever think of, is land use planning. Land use planning is a massive distortion in the economy, but it is politically entrenched. We still have, to all intents and purposes, the Town and Country Planning Act of 1947. So there are lots of votes to be lost by reforming planning, even though I think it would be quite productivity improving in various ways. I just offer that as an obvious example, but we could think of lots of others, I think. Okay? Now, I'm going to argue that Golden Age Britain did fail, and I think the failure is shown by the overtaking. The Golden Age, well, that's economic history shorthand for these years of post-war boom in Europe. So the golden age of growth in Europe is typically seen as from the early 50s to the mid-70s, and it all ends with the OPEC crisis and so on. In that period, Britain did grow slower. We'll see that. We've already seen the implications of it. And although to some extent you couldn't grow as fast as countries which started at a lower level, that's only part of the problem. There's more than that. There's lots of evidence we'll touch on later of poor productivity performance. TFP stands for total factor productivity. It's not just catching up, it's overtaking. We've seen that. But I want also to say that some of the economies that overtook us, most noticeably West Germany, which was perhaps the most successful, was operating, I think, a different variety of capitalism from Britain. It's perhaps known by the Hall and Soskis label of the CME, the coordinated market economy. This is different capital markets, very different industrial relations from Britain. And it's an economy which I think generates an equilibrium between firms and their workers conducive to wage restraint and high investment. Something that we can't, I think, in the end emulate. It's because of our history, because of our institutional legacy. There are downsides to being a CME as well, but this is perhaps their moment in the sun. So if you look at this, and I hope that's bright enough at the back, it's always a bit doubtful when you go to a place for the first time what colours these are going to be projected in. Looks a lot better than when I gave the talk in Greece, similar talk. On the other hand, the Greeks liked this chart, as you can probably guess. What have I done here? I've ordered these European countries from the richest to the poorest as they stood in 1950. So Switzerland has the highest level of real GDP per person in 1950. It's a bit higher than Denmark and a bit higher than the UK. The southern Europeans, as you probably would guess, are at the other end. They've got low income at the start. What that bar chart tells you is that there's something of an inverse correlation here. It's not perfect, but there's an inverse rank correlation. The richer you were in 1950, generally speaking, the less fast you grew during the Golden Age period. But we can use this as a quick diagnostic to say, well, if there were a perfect correlation, you'd see the bars getting a bit bigger as you move to the right across the chart. I've highlighted the UK. The UK is out of line here. If you do the sums, it's not massive, but it adds up over time. It's about 0.7% per year lower than what you might expect on the basis of the perfect rank correlation. Over 25 years, that adds up to close to 20%. It's enough to make a young man like me getting into the labour market in the early 1970s really cross, because if only they hadn't had this failure, my wages would have been bigger. And once I perceived this from the numbers, I was very much Mr. Angry, if you like. There's still angry young men at that time, I think. Okay, you got the idea of that. Incidentally, the other, even bigger failure, but it's not the topic for tonight, is The difference between the UK and other economies is partly in these factors that Howell and I were discussing earlier. How much investment do they do? How much skill formation do they do, if you wish? I've highlighted both of those here. The yellow column is the UK, but you might just want to look at West Germany next to it. I think that's the really interesting comparison here. So investment, that's investment outside of housing, non-residential investment. The UK invested in 1970, it was a perfectly typical year, 14.6% of its GDP. Germany invested just under 20%, about 5 percentage points more. That's quite a lot, and that's absolutely standard through the 1960s. Years of schooling are reasonably similar, although they are a little bit higher in Germany. But what's really interesting, I think, in the rows towards the bottom are the different ways in which those workforces are being skilled or educated. Higher level qualifications is basically degree level, if you like, at this time. So, broadly speaking, we've got about twice as many people with degrees in the labour force as Germany had. Intermediate level qualifications is technicians, people who've done apprenticeships, people who've done vocational training, if you like. It's the other way round there. They've got twice as many as us. And that continues to be the case both through the 60s and the 70s and on into the 80s. We're doing about as much R&D as most other countries. The US is the real outlier, that's highest. We're doing a bit more than France and West Germany. The bad news there is that those who've studied the literature find that British R&D has absolutely no effect on productivity, whereas German R&D actually does raise productivity. So in that case, it's not that you're not doing the R&D spending, it's what you're spending it on and how you're doing the R&D. I'm sorry, I'm probably going to sound like a very old-fashioned left-wing person here, but quite a lot of this is basically in Britain defence, or it's grand projet. The Concorde was a great technical achievement, but it's not good for British productivity. Okay, what sort of things did we get wrong on the policy front? Here I think we want to be looking at supply-side policy, and I'll explain bits of that in a moment. I'm going to suggest that supply-side policy is the things that government can do to change the incentive to invest and to innovate. So a successful supply-side policy would tend to encourage investment and innovation in this story. Before I just itemise a few things which I think were seriously wrong in this period, I want to just introduce the second bullet point. I think that is the key one here. Policy was constrained, was very heavily constrained by the pursuit of full employment. How did that affect supply-side policy? Because British politicians were scared shitless, technical term, that if unemployment became seriously low, wage inflation would take off. Wage inflation was the thing which they didn't see as easily compatible with the level of unemployment to which they aspired. What was the solution? It was all sorts of eventually formal prices and incomes policies. Few people here are old enough to remember some of them. But before that, a long period of an informal social contract, where basically the TUC or big union bosses promised wage restraint in return for what amounted to a veto on policy. And that is essentially what the post-war consensus was. It was a set of limits on what policy could do. So policy was constrained by the need to, or the perceived need, to have trade union cooperation. And that leads us straight to the policy concerns. So what might concern you about taxation? I think the enormously high marginal rates of the period. The top marginal rate of income tax varied between 88 and 97%. I think that's something to do with the pips squeaking. I think I hear them squeaking at that point. Industrial relations, well, trade unions were completely outside the law. We had a tradition of voluntarism. It was impossible to sue a trade union for tort in any way, shape or form. And industrial relations reform was something which was an absolute no-no. for the trade unions, as Barbara Castle found out to her cost, and so did Ted Heath in the late 60s and early 70s. Industrial policy, that was lots of very ill-directed subsidies, which kept some people in business longer than they should have been. And by the 1970s, the infamous picking winners, which I think was as bad as it's painted in the textbooks. Nationalisation, this doesn't seem to be known in all parts these days, but everyone agreed that nationalisation had been a major failure by the 1970s. Read the Neddo report of 1976, and there are people who are sympathetic to nationalisation. Nationalisation was essentially ownership without control, and it ended up in extremely low levels of productivity in the nationalised industry sector. Protectionism was left over from the 1930s, but it took us a long time to get rid of it. One reason being, we didn't join the EEC in 1957. The countries which did reduced their tariffs a lot quickly. We went the EFTA route, and it took longer. It was only really in the 1970s that you start to see this eventually moving away. You can see symptoms like this across many European countries, but I think we got it more seriously wrong. And we did have this, which I'm going to finish on in a minute, damaging interaction with the institutional legacy. Now, if you think about the sorts of things that you usually hear about post-war British industry, I think that's a list you'll probably see. Weak and incompetent management, terrible industrial relations, lots of inefficiency in the use of inputs. An economist ought to ask the question, supposing that is true, what allowed it to persist? It's the persistence of this problem which is the interesting thing. I'm going to suggest the thing which allowed it to persist was very weak competition in most product markets in the economy. Weak competition protected bad managers, both against entry and, more importantly, probably against their shareholders. Weak competition allowed those effort bargains which the unions liked so much in Coventry in the 1970s. It's the fact that we've got a high degree of separation of ownership and control in British companies and a peculiar structure of unionism interacting. Okay, so why does competition matter? Essentially, entry threats keep the incumbents honest. That's the basic point there. Competition matters more if shareholders are weak. What do I mean by weak? They're not very good at controlling management. Why might they not be? Because there are many, many, many of them. Diffuse shareholding, diffuse institutional shareholding becomes the characteristic of Britain by the 1960s and 70s. People who've tried to measure the effects of competition on management suggest it has a strong effect. Absence of competition, and you see the effort bargain point, which I've made already. Okay? Then what are the key institutional legacies? I'll call it of the early start, but you don't have to have that. What were the institutions which we entered the post-war years with and which interacted so badly with this non-competitive environment? Well, trade unions are in a privileged position. They also operate on a decentralised basis. The TUC is pretty weak, really. Individual unions and then individual shop stewards do the bargaining. High degree of separation of ownership and control. That basically says British companies are typically not owner-managed, and they are typically owned, big companies at least, by many quite small shareholders. Impaired productivity. And this implied that you couldn't achieve the coordinated market economy. Let me just briefly explain that. We've probably not got time to go into it. But the idea of the coordinated market economy in this period is that if firms and workers can cooperate with each other, trust each other, or generate institutions which create the equivalent of trust, the workers might accept low wages now for lots of investment by the firm and higher wages later on. You ought to have an attachment to the firm to believe that, but it's a possibility. Lichen Green argues that perhaps countries like Germany and Sweden could implement that model. It's very clear that the UK couldn't. So if that was the route to success, we were shut out from it because we didn't have the centralised unionism which was a prerequisite. So the two sorts of institutional legacies. Britain had a very high degree of separation of ownership and control. We had a variety of Anglo-American capitalism, and this starts out with the sort of banking system we have in the 19th century, and then as company law, tax, various other things change in the economy, shareholding becomes increasingly diffuse, and in the end is diffuse shareholding with institutional investors who are very poor at holding management to account in the 1960s and 70s. And a key consequence of that, with which we still live today, is short-termism. This is a method of running companies which puts a high premium on the present. The distinctive feature of the British system of industrial relations, craft unionism, lots of firms facing multi-unions. Multi-unions are not really interested in the long-term health of the firm. They free ride on the others. The sharing of rents and the effort bargains are all part of that. But craft unionism was highly politically entrenched at the start of the 20th century, and this tradition of legal voluntarism and leaving unions outside the law left it in place. Okay, summing up. At the end of the 1970s then, let's just see where we'd got to. And this, I think, matches your title, Hal. This is a state in turmoil. Okay, there had been a long period of persistent relative economic decline. By now, this post-war consensus, the sort of settings for supply-side policy that I talked about earlier, start to be challenged, and of course, in particular, they're challenged by Mrs. Thatcher and her group. Macroeconomic performance in the 1970s in inflation and unemployment was, particularly inflation, very poor. People started to talk about Britain as an ungovernable society, just remind you. But then we did enter a period of very considerable reform of supply-side policy. This is Thatcher, but it's Thatcher and her sons. It's Blair and Brown as well. And it's reform to industrial relations, it's privatisation, it's changing or abandoning largely industrial policy, reforming tax rates, a really pretty full frontal attack on the things I fingered as going wrong in the 60s and 70s. And Britain's relative growth performance, you saw the numbers right on the second slide. Relative economic decline starts to abate, but it's not so much that we grow faster, it's that the other countries slow down more than we do. Very last slide. After the 1970s, I would argue, but I haven't got time to talk about it this evening, that competition increased a lot in the British economy. This is a combination of deregulation, entry into the EU, which had a big effect on this, and eventually strengthening competition policy. I think the industrial relations problem largely goes away. I suspect some of you are saying, I commute on bloody Southern Railway, and I don't believe you. I think the industrial relations problem went away in sectors which were opened up to competition. And if you think about where industrial relations problems are today, it's probably not characterised by competition. Industrial relations, I think, do get solved. We can talk about it later. If we think that British companies were investing less than, say, German ones, and we worry about short-termism, I don't think Thatcherism was a solution to that, but I do think in some relative economic decline was abated. Now, if I'm basically right about that, that's what underpins my diagnosis of the earlier period. So it comes round together, so to speak. And there we are, that was the last one.
Thank you very much.
To indicate that it's the last one.
That's the last one. Marvelous. State in turmoil. Thank you very much.